This is BBC News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. These are the latest headlines. A shock defeat for Boris Johnson as the Conservatives lose the North Shropshire seat they've held for nearly 200 years to the Liberal Democrats.
The people of North Shropshire have spoken on behalf of the British people. They've said loudly and clearly, Boris Johnson, the party is over. Your government, run on lies and bluster, will be held accountable. It will be scrutinised, it will be challenged, and it can and will be defeated.
It's the seventh biggest by-election swing in modern political history. But the Conservatives insist the defeat was unique because it was caused by the resignation of the former MP Owen Paterson over sleaze.
I completely appreciate voters' frustrations in relation to that. They were angry and they gave us a kicking over it. And the Prime Minister has rightly said that we made mistakes and he regrets that those mistakes that have been made.
Wales announces tighter coronavirus restrictions with the return of social distancing and nightclubs shut from December the 27th. An investigation's underway to determine the cause of a house fire in South London after 4 children died last night. And in sport, England pick up late wickets, giving them some hope on the second day of the second Ashes Test in Adelaide. Hello and good morning. The Liberal Democrats have pulled off a political shock in the North Shropshire by-election, taking one of the country's safest Conservative seats. It follows the resignation of Tory MP Owen Paterson, who was found to have breached parliamentary rules on lobbying. He won the last election in 2019 with a majority of nearly 23,000. But the Lib Dems, Helen Morgan, took the seat by almost 6,000 votes, making it the 7th biggest by-election swing in modern political history. Our regional political editor for the Midlands, Elizabeth Glinker, looks back at the night.
Tonight, the people of North Shropshire have spoken on behalf of the British people. They've said loudly and clearly, Boris Johnson, the party is over. Your government, run on lies and bluster, will be held accountable. It will be scrutinised, it will be challenged, and it can and will be defeated.
A historic victory for the Liberal Democrats, overturning a Tory majority of nearly 23,000, a swing even bigger than the one that won Chesham and Amersham.
This is a huge result that is going to send shockwaves through Westminster. Helen Morgan is the first Liberal Democrat and the first woman to win in North Shropshire, and she has given the Prime Minister a bloody nose.
It's been an intense campaign fuelled by accusations of sleaze, Christmas parties and COVID rebellions. Sensing the opportunity, the Lib Dems flooded the area with activists and have been rewarded. Turnout 46%, 12% higher than the recent by-election in Old Bexley and Sidcup, and a majority of almost 6,000. North Shropshire is a large rural constituency, and while the PM was clearly an issue on the doorstep, the Lib Dems have also tapped into the feeling that this true blue seat has been forgotten by the Conservatives. Their candidate Neil Shastri-Hurst fighting a losing battle.
We do need to reflect upon the result, and I'm sure as a party we will do that. But I'll repeat it again. I'm sure you'll understand if we all go and get a bit of shut eye, and I go and give my 8-week-old a bit of a cuddle.
The winner was jubilant as she celebrated with the Lib Dem leader on the phone, Ed Davey isolating at home with COVID. And then the departure. Lots of questions now for the Prime Minister. Elizabeth Glinker, BBC News, Shropshire.
Well, the by-election result comes after a turbulent month, of course, for the Prime Minister, with questions about lockdown parties in Downing Street last year and a rebellion of 100 of his MPs this week over COVID regulations. Let's get more now from our political correspondent, Ben Wright, who is in Westminster. No doubt this is a huge defeat for the Tories, isn't it, Ben?
Yeah, it's colossal and tops off a wretched week for Boris Johnson. I mean, the fact that the Liberal Democrats have demolished one of the biggest Tory majorities in the country, I think is going to cause huge reverberations through the parliamentary Tory party, which has already been reeling after weeks and weeks of wretched headlines about sleaze and dishonesty. and hypocrisy. The question is now, what happens? Does the discontent that voters in North Shropshire have shown at the ballot box sort of translate to some sort of movement here among Conservative MPs? Oliver Dowden is the Conservative Party's chairman. He said today that, yeah, sure, the party's had a kicking, but he didn't think it represented a massive sea change.
I completely accept how voters feel fed up, given the unique circumstances of this election in particular. So I understand how this began with the resignation of the incumbent MP and the sleaze allegations around that. I also understand how, going through it, there were many reports about the conduct of these alleged parties, as you're very familiar with, and I have heard people's concerns about that. And I think it is really important that as a government, we demonstrate that we are focused on getting on with what the people's priorities are, getting on with the job. And that means focusing on things like the booster campaign, because faced with this surging Omicron virus, it is absolutely essential. The government's focus is laser-like on getting Britain boosted.
Oliver Dowden. Now, we've already heard from some Tory MPs this morning. Sir Roger Gale, veteran backbencher, long-time critic actually of Boris Johnson, said today that it was 2 strikes for the Prime Minister, suggesting his position this morning was much more precarious than it had been before this result was called, and that it was possible there would be some sort of move by the parliamentary party against the Prime Minister unless things improve. We also heard from Sir Charles Walker, another senior Tory backbencher, who said that really that was ridiculous. Nobody within the Tory party in Parliament wants to see a leadership challenge during the course of a pandemic. And I don't think that letters are going to be sent into the chair of the 1922 committee in great numbers in the coming days. We are heading into Christmas. Things will cool down naturally, possibly, over the next couple of weeks. But I think this is really a sort of a worrying moment for Tory MPs. They've always seen Boris Johnson as an electoral winner, a sort of Heineken politician that can reach parts of the electorate that others can't. He was, of course, the Conservative Mayor of London. Only 2 years ago, he pulled off a pretty historic victory for the party, giving them an 80-seat majority, their biggest since 1987. But currents in politics can shift dramatically. And if Tory MPs start to feel that Boris Johnson is no longer an electoral winner, indeed becoming an electoral liability, perhaps they'll start to think about how long he should remain in number 10.
Ben Wright, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's speak now to the Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, Daisy Cooper, joining us from North Shropshire. Congratulations, of course, to you for this victory. How big a win is it for the Lib Dems, given, as the Tories say, Oliver Dowden says, this is a very unique set of circumstances, and often in midterms, governments get a bit of a kicking in a by-election?
Well, I think it's a huge moment. It's a watershed moment in British politics. It's not a one-off. This is the second stunning by-election win for the Liberal Democrats this year. Our first was in Chesham and Amersham, the second one here in North Shropshire. And though they are 2 very different kinds of seats in 2 different parts of the country, there was an overwhelming sense in both of them that lifelong Conservative voters now feel taken for granted by the Conservative Party, and they're simply not prepared to keep voting for them anymore.
What exactly were people saying to you on the doorstep, canvassing? Why have people shifted? Because, it is a huge shift, because this is one of the safest Tory seats traditionally.
The number one issue was health services. People in North Shropshire are absolutely furious that the Conservative Party have driven the health services into the ground. Story after story of people waiting for ambulances that simply do not turn up, struggling to access their GPs. We spoke to farmers who feel really betrayed by the lack of subsidies and support from the government. But of course, there is this huge anger over Partygate as well, and the way that Boris Johnson and his government have handled all of that.
So if your priority is to get rid of the Conservatives at the next election, whenever it comes in 18 months, 2 years, isn't the obvious answer and the obvious implication from this year's wins that you should have some sort of informal alliance even with the Labour Party? Because otherwise you can't do it.
I think what we showed in both Chesham and Amersham and here in North Shropshire is that voters can make up their own minds. There were no pacts in either of these seats, and here in North Shropshire, the Labour Party were actually working incredibly hard over the last couple of weeks in some parts of the constituency. So we think voters can make up their own minds, and Liberal Democrats will continue to focus on those areas where we think we can beat Conservatives.
OK, Daisy Cooper, Deputy Leader of the Lib Dems, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Thank you. Well, as our political correspondent Ben Wright mentioned, Conservative backbenchers have been giving their reaction this morning. On the Today programme, Sir Roger Gale said, "I think the Prime Minister is in last orders time. 2 strikes already, one earlier in the vote in the Commons, now this, 1 more strike and he's out." Well, Sir John Redwood is the Conservative MP for Wokingham. Thanks very much for joining us. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I think the electors in the by-election have sent a very clear message that they want the government to improve, raise its game, make various changes. I'm not surprised by that. Clearly, the government has had difficulties against the background of the pandemic and the arguments over how far you should go in imposing restraints on people. Liberal Democrats very wisely decided to oppose the vaccine passports just before the by-election, which obviously helped them a bit. But I think the overall problem is an economic one. Inflation is too high, energy prices are going up too much, and the Chancellor is imposing tax rises from April, which I think are very unwelcome.
So you don't think that your main problem is the Prime Minister himself?
No, he's always been the man who can attract votes and appeal very widely. I think the issue is the performance of the government, and I think it has struggled a bit against the background of the pandemic.
But who do you blame for that if you don't blame Boris Johnson? Because we have seen a torrent of concerns, especially in recent weeks.
Well, I mainly blame the pandemic, which has obviously made it very difficult to pursue the optimistic, recovery-based, levelling up agenda which we were elected on and which the Prime Minister is very dedicated to achieving. But if I had to single out a particular department that I think has made life difficult for people, it would be the Treasury. I think the tax rises were a very bad idea. The economy has now slowed almost to a halt in the last set of figures after quite a vigorous recovery at the beginning. And the Treasury, it started well by giving a lot of support at the time of the original lockdowns. Understandably, withdrew a lot of that support, but went on to impose these tax rises. And I think that was a mistake.
So what do you think precisely the government should do in response to this huge defeat? I mean, this is one of the safest Tory seats. What do you specifically want the government to do now in response?
Well, what I want it to do is to get behind the levelling up and the economic recovery agenda, limit the damage of anti-pandemic measures on the economy, and where the measures are damaging, you have to provide some offsetting support. Above all, I would cancel the national insurance tax rise. I would take VAT off domestic fuel because fuel prices are far too high. And I would ask the Energy Department to make sure we produce more of our own gas and more of our own electricity. We're too import dependent, and their policy until recently has been to make us ever more import dependent, which means higher prices and greater scarcity. I think you've got to tackle the things that are really hitting everybody's budgets around the country. And the main things that have hit or are about to hit are energy prices and taxes.
So what would you say to fellow Conservatives who are critical of the Prime Minister's performance? I mean, you have total 100% faith in him, do you, to lead the Tories into the next election?
Well, I would say that he was a very important part of the attraction of the Conservative Party and its message in the general election not that long ago. And that what we need to do is to help him and support him see through the right agenda for Britain now, which must be optimism, levelling up, economic growth, promotion of more and better paid jobs at home. We need to do things like grow more of our own food instead of have policies that try and take us out of farming, for example. So I think there are changes he needs to lead and make, and I'd urge him to do so. OK, we'll have to leave it there. John Redwood, many thanks indeed for your time. Well, let's get more on this huge political move overnight in New Zealand. Policy editor Lewis Goodall has been following it all for us. Hi there.
Yes, Geeta, this was a by-election for the history books. Let us be clear. North Shropshire was as true blue as it gets. Conservative for as long as Britain has truly been a democratic country. Indeed, before massively leave voting, older than average population, and it is now represented by a Liberal Democrat. It takes their total in Parliament to 13. That Liberal Democrat, Helen Morgan, there she is there, overcame a Conservative majority of some 23,000 mammoth. This is how she did it. Lib Dems leapfrogging from third, they only got 10% of the vote in 2019, to first 2021 with nearly 50%. And they did it by direct transference to the Lib Dems from the Conservatives, whose vote was down some 25 points or so from 2019, and from the Labour Party, who was actually second in 2019. They had 22% of the vote, but there's a big difference. You can see it there in 2021, only down to 3,686 votes. Lib Dems really leapfrogging. Astonishing results, really. We should also mention a lot of Conservatives clearly decided to stay at home. Turnout was way, way down. Labour voters clearly, though, decided that the Lib Dems had the best chance of winning, and they were right. We saw a similar thing in Chesham and Amersham, another Tory seat, different part of the country in Buckinghamshire, but massive tactical voting against the Conservatives, long talked about, does seem now actually to be happening. And that translated to a swing of some 34%. We can barely can't put the swingometer up because it's off the scale. 34%. Lib Dems needed 26%. It's way past that. It's actually the seventh biggest by-election swing since 1945, reminiscent of some of those huge anti-Conservative swings we saw in the 1990s. And that is what will worry a slew of Conservative MPs in the south of England. You can't really see it very well here, but these are all the top Conservative Lib Dem targets, where the Lib Dems are in second place. 91 of them mainly against the Conservatives. And so this list of Tory MPs with small majorities against the Lib Dems, so you've got seats like Wimbledon or Carshalton and Wellington, Cheltenham there, 981, Winchester, 985, way, way smaller majorities than we saw in Shropshire or Cheshire and Amersham. One in particular that stands out, Esher and Walton, the seat of none other than the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, only a majority there of just under 3,000. Tories haven't seriously had to worry about the Lib Dems since they ingested them and spat them out again after the coalition. A Lib Dem revival changes the complexion of our electoral politics. So let's neither overstate nor understate. This is a sensational result, but it's also a by-election. They can light up the electoral sky and fizzle and mean little. But what it does mean, taken together with the Chesham and Amersham result, is the Lib Dems threaten to be back as a force, and that Boris Johnson, who has for so long looked invulnerable, to whom nothing would stick, is no longer so. And that will change what he can do and his power over his party. Geeta.
Lewis, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Welsh Government is to bring back tighter COVID restrictions just after Christmas, including the closure of all nightclubs in an effort to try and slow the spread of the Omicron variant. Meanwhile, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has cut short a trip to the United States to hold crisis talks with business leaders whose industries have been hit by cancellations because of the virus. Libo De Seco reports.
A smaller Christmas is a safer Christmas. The message today from the Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford. He's set to introduce a return to tougher COVID restrictions after Christmas in preparation for a large wave of Omicron infections. There'll be a new two-phase plan combining a mixture of advice for over the Christmas period and new regulations to follow. In Wales, nightclubs will have to close on December the 27th. In offices, the 2-metre rule on social distancing returns. And businesses will have to introduce measures such as one-way systems and physical barriers to protect customers and staff. The Welsh Government says £60 million is being made available for firms affected by the new restrictions.
If we get the high levels, very high levels of community transmission that we're anticipating, then it's inevitable that people are going to end up going into hospitals, requiring oxygen, going into ITU facilities and potentially dying.
Elsewhere, these few determined revellers on the streets of London. This area would usually be full of people. But now the atmosphere is subdued. With a new variant spreading, many Christmas parties have been cancelled. The Prime Minister says he's not telling people to cancel events, but instead urging them to exercise caution. Thursday saw a record high in cases for a second day in a row. Nearly 90,000 were reported. That's almost 10,000 more than the previous day. And the fear is that things could get worse, impacting on businesses. Chancellor Rishi Sunak has cut short a trip to the US for crisis talks with business leaders on how to help the hospitality sector.
Until spring of next year, most businesses in the hospitality industry are only paying a quarter of their normal business rates bill. They are benefiting from a reduced rate of VAT all the way through to next spring. And thirdly, there is about £250 million of cash sitting with local authorities that's been provided by government to support those businesses.
In Scotland, new rules for shops and hospitality venues have come into force to deal with the rise in cases caused by the Omicron variant. People will be asked to limit socialising to 3 households at a time in the run-up to Christmas. There'll be a return to measures to cut down on crowding in shops. And businesses will be legally required to take steps to reduce the spread of COVID. As coronavirus cases rise and records continue to be broken, the booster programme also reaches new highs, setting more records for daily top-up doses. But with streets and bars as empty as this, one thing seems clear. For businesses that depend on us going out, the coming weeks are unlikely to feel very festive. Lebuti Seko, BBC News.
So, as we've been hearing in that report, from December the 27th, all nightclubs in Wales will be forced to close and there will be a requirement for people to work from home where possible. Our correspondent Thomas Morgan has been speaking to the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford.
Well, I think it's the nature of the nightclub that people go there in order to be up close and personal. And we know that Omicron is particularly likely to lead to super spreader events where people are packed in together in that way. And I think you can distinguish between nightclubs and the way that bars and restaurants operate.
No restrictions at the moment on the hospitality industry. Could that change?
Yes, that could change. I want hospitality to reopen after Christmas, but I wanted to do it in a way that gives customers confidence to return to those places.
Well, a short while ago, our Wales correspondent Thomas Morgan gave us this further update.
In his press conference at midday today, the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, will tell everyone in Wales that they need to be cautious between now and Christmas, really. He said that a small Christmas is better than none at all, that if people get COVID, obviously that would ruin the day for them, really. He's suggesting that everyone take a lateral flow test before they go out and meet anyone, that they take a day in between seeing different groups of people, that they go for their boosters and vaccinations when they get the call to do so as soon as possible. And if they do meet people, to try and do so outside if that's possible. And then on the 27th, restrictions will be coming back into play in Wales. Nightclubs will be shutting here. The First Minister going further than any of the other home nation leaders in the UK by closing an industry, again, due to the potential threat of the Omicron variant of COVID here. Although the numbers are lower in Wales, there is a concern, as we know, that it can spread so quickly, and with such a deep pressure on the NHS already in Wales, there is concern it could overwhelm the NHS as well. When I spoke to the First Minister earlier this morning, he did suggest that there could be potential for more restrictions to come in some areas of society. He did suggest that he'd be speaking to the hospitality sector about potential restrictions there. He also said that on Monday he'll be meeting with the Cabinet discussing about whether they need to be curbing the amount of people that can go and watch sporting events in stadiums for the next few weeks as well, and for big events as well. One of the things he was very unhappy about was when it came to financial assistance. He has written to Westminster twice already, just as Nicola Sturgeon has done, asking for extra financial support to give to businesses if additional restrictions was put into place. That hasn't come just yet, but it's clear from what the First Minister is saying and what he says today that there is a huge concern with regards to the Omicron variant, and it wouldn't be a surprise at all if in the next coming days and weeks we would see more restrictions coming into play in Wales.
Thomas Morgan there. Well, as we've been hearing, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has cut short a trip to the United States, and he is facing calls from hospitality firms and businesses calling for more support. With me now is Michelle Ovens, CBE, founder of Small Business Britain. Thanks for joining us. What does the government need to do now, given, we're seeing many fears from small businesses across the country?
So you're absolutely right. Lots of businesses are really concerned, and it's not just hospitality. Obviously, that's front line, and it's making a lot of headlines. But footfall has dropped, and people working at home increasingly is affecting a huge number of sectors across the board. And it just isn't time now to wait and see how this plays out. Even without the legal restrictions in place, the businesses are feeling the effects. So, we've been talking about businesses needing help with cash flow over the winter, but I think now that's just not going to be enough. Across the board, rates need to be cut and frozen for all sectors, absolutely. We do need to see cash flow measures brought in, so things like delay to bounce back loan repayments. 1.5 million small businesses have got bounce back loans. That's a huge burden. Delay to tax payments, that's within the gift of HMRC. And also, utility and landlords also need to be brought into this as well. Some of those bills that are going out constantly from small businesses when there's just no cash coming in. And then looking at some of the other big programmes that we had in previous lockdowns. So local authority grants, we heard there about Welsh Government asking Westminster for more cash, and I think we're going to have to see some emergency grants coming from local authorities to small businesses, and we're going to have to start talking about the furlough scheme coming back. We are hearing from a lot of businesses that they're just not going to be able to afford to pay their staff bills in January. Whether it's hospitality, retail, health and beauty, massively hit. I talked to a hairdresser's this morning that's had 200 cancellations in just over a week. They're just not going to be able to keep the doors open if we don't step in soon.
Of course, all that costs, and there's already been fears in many parts of the Conservative Party, for example, about tax rises. Is it not wiser, perhaps, to see whether the Omicron variant peaks quickly and businesses can cope for a few weeks and hope that things economically pick up pretty quickly in the new year?
The challenge is that you're talking about small businesses and they don't have a few weeks. You're coming off the back of a year and a half of really difficult times for small businesses. A lot of them just don't have reserves, and there's a huge amount more debt now, of course, in the small business community. The Chancellor said in the autumn budget in October how the interventions that they made over the pandemic put us in a much better position to recover. And of course, he was right. Keeping those businesses going, supporting those businesses means that we're in a position to help them recover and help get on our feet after the pandemic ends. And that remains the case now. We can't now stop that support when we've got such a tsunami of challenges coming to small businesses.
But do you still have faith that the Chancellor's got his eye on the ball here? He was just in the US having to come back early, despite the fact that Omicron's been coming, and we've heard about these warnings of tsunamis of cases.
The challenge has come so quickly. It has come so quickly. Every time there have been more restrictions in the past, the Treasury has announced more support packages. So we stay optimistic that will happen. We know across society there's a huge amount of support for small businesses. People do want to rally behind them and support them. And hopefully that's going to translate into cash in the next few days, because these businesses, 6 million businesses, they employ nearly 17 million people. This is not just a nice to have. This is core to our economic recovery. We need to keep these businesses going so that we can recover in 2022 and get the whole of the economy back on its feet.
OK, Michelle Ovens, founder of Small Business Britain, thank you very much indeed. Let's catch up with the weather now. Here's Owen. It's been pretty mild, but I hear it's getting colder.
Yes, it is, Geeta, absolutely. We're importing colder air over the next couple of days, and actually we're going to start cranking down those temperatures as we look towards the weekend. Here's how today's looking, though. You can see quite a bit of cloud cover here on the graphics. We've got some dense mist and fog patches through the Vale of York, parts of the north of England, stretching down through some eastern parts of England as well. Some bright spells developing. You can see some gaps in the cloud here across western parts of Wales, southwest of England, parts of Scotland as well. Temperatures getting to 10 or 11 Celsius. Very little change overnight. The return of some mist and fog patches. Where we see the clear skies, temperatures will dip quite low, and we could see some slippery surfaces first thing tomorrow morning. And tomorrow is a very similar sort of day, really. There's the headline for the weekend. A lot of cloud around. It will gradually turn a bit cooler then. Some gaps in that cloud, though. Sunny spells across parts of Scotland. Again, through western parts of Wales, southwest of England as well. Top temperatures getting to about 10 or 11 Celsius. Then on Sunday, we crank down those temperatures, another cloudy one, cooling off as we head through next week.
Is the world of opera changing? We had to start more with using technology and using streaming, for instance. Find out about its growing global appeal from the biggest names in opera today and two of the superstars of the future.
Take Me to the Opera with Zainab Badawi. Watch on iPlayer.
We've had 2 incredibly intense weeks of negotiations, and we arrive at what I believe is the moment of truth for our planet.
My concern is not only that we have high levels of bed weights, but my bigger concern is that I'm not sure what we can do about it.
The Taliban aren't forbidding girls to go to school. They're just not saying anything at all about it.
We kind of want life to pick up where it left off, just being a normal family.
The BBC News Channel, more than just the headlines.
Hello, this is BBC News. I'm Geeta Guru-Murthy. The headlines. A shock defeat for Boris Johnson as the Conservatives lose the North Shropshire seat they've held for nearly 200 years to the Liberal Democrats. It's the 7th biggest by-election swing in modern political history, but the Conservatives insist the defeat was unique because it was caused by the resignation of the former MP Owen Paterson over sleaze. Wales announces tighter coronavirus restrictions with the return of social distancing and nightclubs shut from December the 27th. An investigation is underway to determine the cause of a house fire in South London after 4 children died last night. In sport, England pick up late wickets, giving them some hope on the second day of the second Ashes Test in Adelaide. Let's catch up with a bit more sport now. Sarah is with us. Cricket is keeping everyone happy in my house, Sarah.
Yeah, it's certainly proving a big distraction, I think, as to what is going on out there. Sport, always good for that. Let's start then with the latest from the second Ashes Test in Adelaide, where Australia, they have continued to build a big score on day 2. However, as you have been hearing, England have taken wickets to ensure that they are not completely out of it just yet. England did get a breakthrough early on, not long after Marnus Labuschagne reached his century. He was trapped LBW by Ollie Robinson. England skipper Joe Root then managed to remove Travis Head before Ben Stokes clean bowled Cameron Green. Aussie captains Steve Smith and Alex Carey, they pushed on, looking to post a big first innings score before both fell to James Anderson just before tea. They are into the final session now. Australia at 435 for 7 at the moment. You can, of course, follow it across the BBC. Well, with another 5 Premier League games called off ahead of this weekend, the debate has intensified on what to do about the impact of COVID on football. Manchester United, Brentford, Watford, Norwich and Leicester all have COVID outbreaks amongst their squads, leading to their games being cancelled. That means that there have been 9 Premier League games called off in the space of a week. Well, Liverpool did play last night despite suffering from a COVID outbreak themselves. Curtis Jones, Virgil van Dijk and Fabinho all missed their game against Newcastle.
I don't see the massive benefit in it because we come back and it's still the same. If the virus would be gone then, I'm the first who stops and goes home and waits until it's gone. But that's probably not the case. So where's the real benefit of it? I don't know it, but there are. So now so we hope we can play. Honestly, we hope we can play, and I hope Tottenham can play and all this kind of things, so then play on Sunday.
Well, elsewhere, the Chelsea women's boss, Emma Hayes, blamed anxiety and worry over COVID for her side's below-par performance as they were knocked out of the Champions League last night. They had only needed a point to progress as group winners, but they were beaten 4-0 by Wolfsburg to end their Champions League hopes. The result also means that they haven't won in 3 matches since winning the FA Cup. Max Verstappen finally got his hands on the Formula One World Championship trophy last night at the FIA prize-giving ceremony. Lewis Hamilton didn't attend the gala. Verstappen was asked if he felt sorry for Hamilton after the controversial end to Sunday's final race. Hamilton's Mercedes team saying yesterday that their driver had been robbed of the title and left disillusioned with the sport.
I don't feel sorry, but I can understand, of course, that it can be very painful. But at the end of the day, that's racing as well. You know, you have to just keep fighting till the end, and you know that in racing anything can happen. And I mean, he also won a championship like that. So, yeah, I think he can understand as well.
And the four-time women's darts champion Lisa Ashton is still waiting for her first victory at the PDC World Darts Championship. The Lancashire Rose was making her third appearance at Alexandra Palace, but up against the world number 53, Ron Moulenkamp. She never quite got going. The man from the Netherlands won by 3-0. Elsewhere, two former champions met as Gary Anderson beat Adrian Lewis. And that is all the sport for now. Australia 445 for 7 in their first innings in the cricket. Geeta, which you can, of course, follow on the BBC Sport website.
Yes, everyone is watching it either too late or too early at the moment for me. But anyway, it's the Christmas holidays soon. Thanks very much, Sarah. Let's return to the North Shropshire by-election, where the Lib Dem scored a huge surprise victory by taking one of the country's safest Tory seats. Winner Helen Morgan overturned a Tory majority of almost 23,000, declaring that the party is over for the PM. Well, she won by nearly 6,000 votes. That's a swing of 34% from Conservative to the Lib Dems, the 7th biggest by-election swing since the war. While in her victory speech, Helen Morgan accused the Prime Minister of presiding over a nightly soap opera of calamity and chaos.
Tonight, the people of North Shropshire have spoken on behalf of the British people. They've said loudly and clearly, Boris Johnson, the party is over. Your government, run on lies and bluster, will be held accountable. It will be scrutinised, it will be challenged, and it can and will be defeated. Across the country, the Liberal Democrats are taking on the Conservatives and winning. In rural Shropshire today, just like in Buckinghamshire in June, we have won the support of the people who have always voted Conservative and people who have always opposed them. Thousands of lifelong Conservative voters, dismayed by Boris Johnson's lack of decency and fed up with being taken for granted. And thousands of lifelong Labour voters choosing to lend their votes to the candidate who can defeat the Conservatives. People who believe that our politics should be about creating a better country for us all, not a nightly soap opera of calamity and chaos. All of them casting their ballots for the Liberal Democrats. And let me say specifically to all those Labour supporters who lent their votes today, thank you. You have shown tonight that together we can defeat the Conservatives, not with deals behind closed doors, but with common sense at the ballot box.
Well, the winning candidate there, Helen Morgan, now an MP, of course, for the Lib Dems. I'm joined now by Sir John Curtis, a political analyst and Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University. Thanks so much for joining us, John Curtis. For everyone watching, in simple terms, how big a swing, how big a victory for the Lib Dems is this?
This is not quite an unprecedented swing, but it's a very spectacular one. And it is one that underlines the message of the polls in the last week that the Conservatives have suffered quite significant electoral damage in the wake of Partygate, etc. As you already mentioned, swing 34%. Well, there's one other by-election, but only one other by-election in which the swing from the Conservatives to Liberal Democrats in a Conservative-held seat has been bigger. That was in Christchurch back in 1993. 31-point drop in the Conservative vote. We've not seen drops of that scale in Conservative support since John Major suffered a trio of them between 1992 and 1997, which of course is not a very happy precedent for the Conservatives. But the other remarkable thing about this is that this has happened in a constituency which was not natural Liberal Democrat territory. Now, back in Chesham and Amersham, in the summer, that was a constituency where one thought, the Liberal Democrats might do it because that was a constituency that had voted Remain. The Liberal Democrats were associated with the Remain cause. And we already knew from the results in 2019 that the Tories had been losing some ground in that constituency. This, however, is a constituency that had a 60% Leave vote. So this was not natural Liberal Democrat territory. And I think certainly one thing that perhaps all the parties have learnt in the wake of this by-election is that perhaps for the first time since 2010, when they went into coalition with the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats are once again the party of by-election protest, particularly for Conservative voters, and that they have come back with that role in a rather spectacular fashion in this by-election.
And is that because voters realised that, rather than voting Labour, even if that's where their sympathies might have been, the way to unseat the Tories, if that was their priority, was to go with the Lib Dems. And what about the Conservative, Oliver Dowden defence saying, well, this was just unique, it's a one-off, it's midterm blues?
Well, it's certainly true. Part of this reason why the Liberal Democrats won is the 12-point drop in the Labour vote. And without that, the Liberal Democrats would not have won, given that it looks as though most of those votes went to the Liberal Democrats' direction. And I guess in a constituency which has never had a Labour MP, it was perhaps rather easier for Labour voters to switch to Liberal Democrats than it might have been elsewhere. But as far as Oliver Dowden's defence is concerned, well, sure, we do get governments, it's difficult for them in by-elections. I mean, even in Old Bexley, which they hung on to, 13-point drop in their support. But there's a big difference between a 13-point drop in support and a 31-point drop in support. This is actually the second biggest fall in Conservative support in any by-election they were trying to defending where there wasn't some unusual intervention by a third-party candidate. So this isn't just a normal bit of by-election protest. This is a very substantial piece of by-election protest. And it's occurred at a time, if we go back now, basically the Conservative Party has lost between about 6 and 8 points in the national opinion polls since the affair that started this whole saga that ended up with the North Shropshire by-election result, which was the Owen Paterson affair of a month ago. That's a pretty substantial loss in a very short space of time. And it is something that should worry the Conservative Party. I think in particular what they need to realise, a lot of the coalition that got Boris Johnson to power in 2019 was Leave voters who haven't necessarily voted for the Conservatives at all. They don't necessarily have the sinews of traditional loyalty that will keep them voting Conservative in difficult times. If those voters begin to doubt the ethics and the competence of this government, and perhaps that's what the poll's suggesting people are now beginning to doubt, those Leave voters in particular may well defect the Conservatives in quite considerable numbers. And indeed, that is already the message of the opinion polls.
So precisely, I mean, what do you read into this more widely? How many Tory seats, for example, would be at risk if you were able to read into that? We've got local elections coming up. How vulnerable, how worried should Tory MPs be?
Well, if we were to do the Peter Snow, let's have a piece of fun and apply all the swings in this by-election to the next general election, the Conservatives will be left with 3 seats. Now, of course, that's not going to happen, but it's another indication of the scale of this. So I think there are 2 things for the Conservatives to worry about. The first is that indeed that Leave vote is potentially relatively fragile. Second, there is a risk that the Liberal Democrats are now back in business and perhaps their ability to eat away, at least in some vital Conservative seats, will have been strengthened. But I think we should also recognise that the future of our politics is probably now intimately tied up with the future of the pandemic, which is inevitably unknowable. But what is true is that this government at the moment is, in a sense, betting the farm that boosting boosters will be enough to deal with the pandemic and the NHS will not be overwhelmed. And I guess everyone hopes that that judgment is going to prove right. But if it were to prove wrong, then it may be that the Conservatives will find this a very difficult position to recover from. A combination of people doubting their ethics over Partygate, if that were to be combined with doubts over their competence over a major public health crisis, that might be an irrecoverable position.
Sir John Curtis, thank you very much indeed for joining us, as always. Well, I'm joined now by Sian Jones, who was a special advisor in David Cameron's government. She is now a political consultant with Sec Newgate. Thanks for joining us. What's your take on this huge defeat?
Well, I mean, I think by any measure, it's a pretty terrible result for the government and for the Prime Minister in particular. I mean, I think, and it's obvious that the Christmas party scandal has played into the result hugely. I mean, if you just compare with the old Bexley and Sidcup by-election just a few weeks ago, which the Conservatives held on to, albeit with a reduced majority, compared to the catastrophic defeat that we've seen here, I think there's clearly a lot of lessons to be learned and a lot of thinking to be done inside 10 Downing Street in terms of how the government is operating at the moment and in terms of how, in particular, how Number 10 is being run.
And is it just a question of shaking up the staff in Number 10, or is it about looking at who leads the government?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the Prime Minister's leadership, I mean, I think I think at the moment that I think one of his saving graces really is that there aren't that many obvious alternative candidates with the same sort of political reach that he has. I mean, I think, as John Curtis was just saying, that he's shown the ability to reach across political divides, particularly into some of those seats in the north of the country where the Conservatives have historically never really had a presence. And I think in terms of trying to find an alternative leader who can achieve the same electoral success and indeed who has those political communication skills. Let's not forget that Boris Johnson is probably one of the best political communicators in our public life. I think that's going to be quite a tall order, particularly when, as you've been saying, we're in the middle of a public health crisis. And
so you're saying that even if that we've had this massive swing, a huge vote of lack of confidence by the public, that the Tories can't find anybody better than Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, I think clearly there are going to be some discussions about it, and particularly we're going into the Christmas recess now, which I think is an opportunity for, I mean, in some ways it's an opportunity for the government to regroup, but it's also an opportunity for Conservative MPs to have a long, hard think about the future of the party. But I think that I think they will be aware that, Boris Johnson has, of course, delivered them an enormous majority and has been very successnow for them electorally.
It's one thing, though, isn't it? It's one thing that he won, on the basis of Brexit. The evidence seems to be that issue is now in the past. People are worried about competence, honesty, ethics, as Sir John Curtis was saying. Do you think from your own sense of Conservatives and the public that you speak to now, are people sure that Boris Johnson is still the right person to lead the Tories? And do you think that increasingly people will be thinking about sending signatures in?
I think he is in a difficult place. I don't think you can deny that, really. I mean, I think this is probably one of the biggest crises that's come in his leadership so far. So I'm not underplaying that at all. I think that it's just really a question, I think, of the timing, and I think how things develop with the virus, over the coming weeks. But I think that there will be a lot of discussions going on internally within the Conservative Party now, and who can take over. But I think that potentially he may have, an opportunity, one more chance to regroup after Christmas, perhaps. But I think that potentially that, the clock will be ticking in terms of demonstrating that they can sort of get a grip on what's been going on here and turn things around and actually start delivering on that sort of transformational economic agenda that they promised in terms of levelling up and so on. And of course, dealing properly with the pandemic. So I think there's a lot of challenges that are coming up in the next few weeks. So I don't think it's going to be an easy time, no.
Just finally, we've heard Sir Oliver Dowden, the Tory party chair, tell the BBC that he's confident that the Cabinet Secretary investigation into the party allegations will vindicate the Prime Minister's assertion that rules weren't broken. Is he prejudging that outcome?
I think it's early to say. I mean, I think the difficulty is, you can talk until you're blue in the face about the rules and whether the rules are followed or not. And I think we saw this with the MP's expenses scandal a few years ago. Everyone was saying, well, it's all within the rules. I think it's not really a question of the rules. I think it's more about how it looks and how it's perceived. And I think a lot of, and regardless, I think, of what this investigation says in a way, I think if it vindicates the Prime Minister, I think it's probably going to be perceived as a whitewash in some ways, because really when people were trying to abide by the rules or having to say goodbye to loved ones over FaceTime or whatever, and people in Number 10 were having parties, I just don't think it's going to be seen as acceptable, regardless of whether it was socially distanced or not. I think it's just the culture and the tone that it sets at this really difficult time for people.
OK, we will leave it there. Sian Jones, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Now, 4 children have died in a house fire in South London. Firefighters gave first aid at the scene in Sutton, but the children, who were 2 sets of twin boys, were aged 3 and 4, later died in hospital. Our reporter Louisa Pilbeam has the latest.
We know that 4 children died in the terrace house in the middle of the road behind me. Their next of kin have been informed. Now, we know that the fire broke out at just before 7 o'clock last night, and 60 firefighters battled to save those children, but they were taken to hospital and they were pronounced dead. Now, I've been hearing from neighbours about what these children were like. They've told me that they were happy children, they were sweet-natured, they were popular, well known in this area, and one story was that they like to stroke one of the neighbours' dogs here on the road. We've also heard about the impact that this has been having on the emergency services. The London Fire Commissioner Andy Rowe said the deaths had left everyone numb with profound sadness. The cause of the fire is not yet known and it will be investigated.
Now, warnings about the new Omicron variant have prompted many people to cancel Christmas dinners and parties, and that's having a devastating effect, of course, on hospitality venues right across the UK. The Chancellor has had to cut short a trip to the United States for crisis talks here with business leaders who've been hit by those cancellations. They're demanding more financial support from government. Our business correspondent Ben Thompson has been at a venue in London Bridge for us today.
I just wanted to show you our vantage point here at London Bridge, because the station probably tells you the story of the rest of the city, and that's because that place should be packed at rush hour this morning, but it's not. A lot of people choosing to work from home, and that has huge consequences for towns and city centres across the country. And for hospitality firms in particular, they are feeling that at a time when they should be making a lot of money in this lucrative Christmas period. And just to run you through the numbers, hospitality firms, so bars, restaurants and hotels, make a quarter of all of their annual profits at this time of year, before those maybe leaner months of January, February and March, when we may not be out quite as much. But the problem is there's been a lot of cancellations. 3 million bookings were cancelled last week alone, and that's because people choosing to stay at home rather than to come out and maybe jeopardise any plans that they had for Christmas. And that comes at a huge price for the industry. £297 million in lost trade in the run-up to Christmas, and that will be felt particularly keenly after what's been a very difficult year for many businesses. And we heard from Sam, who runs a bar in Birmingham, and he explained what some of those implications are for his business, but also for his staff as well.
It's extremely nervous times. I think, under any normal circumstances, we probably wouldn't be necessarily that fearful. But with the previous closure of 14 months and then 6 months under heavy restrictions, the business simply isn't in a position to continue with such heavy loss of trade. And the vast majority of the hospitality sector suffers with exactly the same, nerves at the moment. We're going into the Christmas period, times that we are, due to be spending with our own families. And we're sitting there worrying about our businesses at the moment and whether or not, they're going to be able to come through this next challenge that's been, given to us.
Well, that's Sam's story in Birmingham. Let me introduce you to Kate Nichols, who's with us, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. Kate, good morning.
Good morning.
Just how bad is it for firms right now?
It's very bad. It's a rapidly deteriorating situation. It's changing on a daily basis, but in the last 10 days, we've seen 50% of bookings go, a third of revenues lost over the course of the last 10 days in the rest of the UK. It's double that in central London, so particularly acute in central London. If it carries on, we estimate hospitality could lose £3 to £4 billion this December.
And the problem is, and the criticism that's been levelled at the government, is that this is a lockdown in everything but name. Is that fair?
Well, I think, there is a disconnect between the political policy, the economic reality, and it's caused by consumer confidence, which has just crashed. So people are literally staying away in their droves, and that's where it's slipping on a daily basis. So we need to see, this has happened very rapidly, we need to see urgent and rapid support put in place to compensate these businesses as if it was a lockdown. We need to get the economic reality, the political policy aligned.
Now, I know you've been in those meetings with government ministers, haven't you, on behalf of hospitality firms. What are they telling you about whether there will be support forthcoming?
Well, at the moment, they're in listening mode. We've had extensive discussions with the Treasury Ministers, with the Chancellor, with the Business Secretary over the course of the last 10 days on a daily basis to keep them abreast of the situation and to start talking about the support that is needed. They're listening. They've said they'll go away and think about what they need to do to get this businesses through what will be a very difficult 4 to 6 weeks, and crucially sustain them through January and February when we don't get very much revenue in at all. Even in the good times, those are lean periods.
Yeah, and what is the reality then? If there is no extra support, if there's no extra help, What does it mean for firms like this?
If there is no extra support and help, we are undoubtedly going to see many more hospitality businesses go to the wall. We lost 1 in 10 during the COVID crisis. We could see as many again fail over the course of the next year, particularly with Q1 being such a difficult time to get through. So you will see tens of thousands of business fail and hundreds of thousands of jobs lost.
A lot of people will be looking right now and say there is not an endless money pit. There is not, money forthcoming for a lot of things. The government has to prioritise where it will target help. Does it have to be hospitality?
Well, I think if you're asking hospitality to bear a disproportionate burden and you are effectively closing them down and restricting their trading at what is such a crucial time of the year, you do need to make sure you've got support.
I suppose the government would say they're not doing that. It's people that are choosing to do it.
People are choosing to do it, but the economic reality is the same. Either you let these businesses go to the wall, you let this important economic sector fail, and you have a slower economic recovery when we come out of Omicron in the new year, and you have fewer taxes that are coming through. Let's not forget, hospitality is the 3rd largest employer. It generates £40 billion a year in taxes. That funds vital public services. The economy needs us to be fighting fit and firing on all cylinders. There is no economic recovery unless hospitality recovers.
How confident are you that you will get it? Because we're talking about things like maybe a cut in VAT, maybe a bit of extra relief on things like rent and rates. Are you confident you'll get it?
I think there's 3 key things. Local authorities do have cash grants that they could get out. There's discretionary rate relief that could be got out the doors now. That needs to be topped up for places like London that are disproportionately hit. Extending the rate of VAT, the 12.5%, gives those businesses the confidence to underpin investment and get through the difficult period, and business rates to avoid bills going out that hit cash flow. We've asked for all of those things. Ministers have taken them away to see what they can do.
Kate, for now, thank you. Really nice to see you. Kate Nichols, Chief Executive of UK Hospitality. Now, I just want to show you around this place because, my goodness, it's well decked out, as you can see, for Christmas. Plenty of Christmas trees, plenty of tables, and not many customers. So they'll be really hoping that maybe this place, because it's got a bit of fresh air, it's open air, they'll be able to get some customers through the doors before the Christmas period. But nonetheless, for all hospitality businesses right now, it is a very tough time of year, one that should be one of their most lucrative, and it's proving to be very difficult indeed.
Ben Thompson there. I just want to update you on that very tragic news that 4 young children have died after reports of a house fire in Sutton yesterday, and police are saying that a 27-year-old woman has been arrested on suspicion of child neglect and remains in police custody. 4 children died in that fire, reportedly 2 sets of twins aged 3 and 4. Very sad news. We are keeping you updated, of course, online too. We are back in a few minutes with all the latest. Let's catch up now with the weather. Here's Owain. How's it looking for outdoor socialising, Owain?
Hi, Geeta. Well, over the weekend, we have high pressure nearby, and that remains with us over the next couple of days and into next week as well. This morning, however, it's been quite misty and quite murky. The weather watchers snapping away. We've had some lovely sunrise pictures as well, but yes, pretty grey and pretty murky out there. Some low cloud in places as well. You know, where we see this today, it could be quite reluctant to clear, so the mist and fog potentially hanging around. This is the big picture, if you like, everyone. We have an area of high pressure here. You can see the white lines around it. These are the isobars. Where they're closer, I think we'll see a bit more of a breeze across some southwestern parts of the UK and the very far north of Scotland. But, you know, for most of us, it's a pretty settled story. As I said, the mist and fog slow to clear in places. Hints of brightness and some sunny spells developing here or there, especially, I think, across southwestern parts of England, western fringes of Wales, up towards some parts of the north of England and Scotland there as well. You can see a big gap in the cloud. Where we see the clear skies, we've seen some frost this morning. Temperatures will get to about 9 or 10 Celsius as our highs today, I think. Through tonight, well, very little change. The high pressure is still above us, it's still driving the weather and is still bringing a delivery of settled conditions across much of the UK. Some clear skies where we see that temperature sliding away close to freezing and the return of those mist and fog patches. There's your headline for the weekend. Not a bad headline, actually. It should be mostly dry, a fair bit of cloud around, and we're kind of cranking down the temperatures then as we cast an eye upon the coming days. A familiar story, some clear skies across Scotland, the north of England, seeing that as well, and southwestern fringes seeing some brightness. Often quite cloudy, really wherever we are elsewhere, Northern Ireland, much of England, top temperatures 10 or 11 Celsius. But colder, of course, where we see the more prolonged clear skies. Let's have a quick look at Sunday then. This is how it's looking. The high pressure is slowly sliding away. It remains in charge, however, but we see a bit more of a breeze coming in from the northeast, so cooler along coastal parts, temperatures about 7 or 8 Celsius, potentially a bit higher here or there. And then at this stage, we start to import a colder air mass behind a cold front. You can see the blue colours, they'll start sort of trickling in really as we look towards the early and the middle part of this coming week. And you can see then the outlook, what that's doing. Temperatures will slide away over the next couple of days as we cast an eye upon the end of the week, potentially turning a bit less settled, but for now it's dry and settled. We'll take it. That's the forecast. Stay safe. See you soon.